On September 23rd, 1944, the Belgian farmers working the fields near the small village of Cronin had learned to live with the sky. For 4 long years, the sky had meant occupation, terror, and the roar of the Luftwaffe. Now, in the autumn of 44, the sky had changed masters. It rumbled daily with a new, greater thunder, the sound of liberation, the sound of thousands of Allied bombers, a relentless river of steel flowing towards the German fatherland. The farmers were harvesting sugar beets, their heads down, their ears attuned to the familiar, distant drone of the mighty 8th Air Force, flying miles high in their unassailable formations. But the sound they heard that afternoon was wrong. It wasn't the dull collective rumble of 100 formations. It was the strained, guttural, and desperate whine of a single aircraft, and it was terribly close. They stopped their work, the tools falling from their hands. They shielded their eyes, scanning the low gray clouds that hung heavy over the Belgian countryside. A gasp rippled through the group. It was an American B-17, a Faldai Bay flying fortress, monstrous and magnificent, emerging from the cloud base, impossibly low, skimming the tops of the poplars that lined the fields. It was not on fire. It was not spiraling, trailing the black smoke of its doom. It was flying level, almost peacefully. The farmers, conditioned by years of war, braced for the inevitable. An impact, a fireball, the sickening crunch of metal and men. But the crash never came. With a strange, unnatural, and haunting grace, the colossal 4-engine bomber descended. It seemed to slow, as if a ghostly hand was easing back the throttles. The farmers swore they saw it make a wide, shallow circle over their fields, as if inspecting the ground, as if a spectral pilot was choosing his spot. Then it settled. The massive aircraft glided down, its belly scraping the soft, plowed earth of the beet field. It was a sound not of destruction, but of immense weight sliding through mud. It slid for several hundred yards, its propellers, still turning slowly on 3 engines, biting into the Belgian soil, churning up great fountains of dirt and grass. Finally, the massive silver ship shuddered, groaned, and came to a perfect, complete stop. And then there was silence. A silence more profound, more absolute, and more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. This was no crash. This was an arrival. And the mystery was just beginning. Hours earlier, and 1,000 miles away, that same B-17, bearing the identification numbers of the U.S. 8th Air Force, had been a hive of activity. Its 10-man crew, led by their pilot, Lieutenant John Cronin, performed their final pre-flight checks on a fog-draped airfield in England. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, but they were seasoned veterans of the most brutal aerial campaign in human history. The mighty 8th was tasked with the systematic destruction of the German war machine, a task that required them to fly unescorted for hours into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. Their target for today? A synthetic oil plant deep inside the Reich. This was the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, and the Germans knew it. The defenses would be staggering. Lieutenant Cronin sat in the left-hand seat, his gloved hands flicking switches, his eyes scanning the glowing green dials. He was the commander, his crew, his family, in this aluminum tube trusted him with their lives. Beside him, his co-pilot, Below them, in the plexiglass nose, the navigator and bombardier prepared their maps and bomb sites. Behind them, the flight engineer, the radio operator, and in the isolated, freezing cold of the tail and waist, the gunners. One man, the ball turret gunner, would soon crawl into a tiny, cramped sphere beneath the plane, where he would hang suspended between earth and sky for the next 8 hours. Their aircraft was a B-17G, the latest model of the Flying Fortress. It was a marvel of engineering, a dense, complex machine built for one purpose: to absorb unbelievable punishment and still, somehow, bring its crew home. It bristled with 13.50 caliber heavy machine guns, each a deadly deterrent. But the crews knew the truth. They weren't a fortress. They were a target. As they lifted off, one of hundreds that morning, they joined the vast quote-unquote combat box formation. This was their only defense. A staggering, self-defending armada of bombers, wingtip to wingtip, designed so that their machine guns could create an interlocking field of fire. A quote-unquote fang tu chum, flak defense. They climbed to their operational altitude, 27,000 feet. At this height, the war was abstract, fought in a realm of pure, hostile blue. The temperature inside the unpressurized fuselage plummeted to 40, then 50 degrees below zero. The men clipped on their oxygen masks. Their breath turned to ice crystals that coated the inside of the plane. The electric heating suits they wore often shorted out, leaving them to slowly freeze at their stations. They were flying 4 miles above a hostile continent, held together by aluminum skin, shivering and breathing processed oxygen, every nerve alive to the two things that could kill them: flak and fighters. The mission proceeded as planned over the English Channel in occupied France. It was only when they crossed the border into Germany that the true hell began. The German flak batteries, meticulously plotted and aimed by radar, opened up. The sky, once empty blue, erupted. The crews called them black blossoms. They were the puffs of smoke from 88mm anti-aircraft shells, and each puff was a blossom of jagged, red-hot steel. An explosion precisely calculated to shred metal and men at their exact altitude. The B-17 lurched violently, thrown hundreds of feet by the concussions. The noise was indescribable. A constant, deafening whomp crunch as shrapnel, some pieces as large as a man's fist, hammered against the fuselage like demonic hail. "We were just trying to hold on," one waist gunner from a similar mission recalled. "You couldn't do anything but pray and keep shooting." The whole world was just noise and vibration and the smell of cordite. The smell of cordite, the acrid, sulfurous gunpowder, filled the cabin. It was the smell of the air war. Then, a particularly violent jolt threw Cronin against his straps. "Number 3 is hit," the engineer yelled over the intercom, his voice tight with adrenaline. Cronin and his co-pilot fought the controls. A flak shell had torn through the right wing, shattering the number 3 engine. It sputtered, coughed black oily smoke, and then seized. The crew watched in horror as the propeller refused to feather, It wouldn't turn to a knife's edge to reduce drag. Instead, it stuck, acting as a massive air brake, a barn door in the 200-mile-per-hour wind. The aircraft immediately began to yaw and pull violently to the right, bleeding off airspeed. They were falling out of the protective combat box formation. In the air war of 1944, this was a death sentence. A straggler was a lone wounded animal, and the wolves were always watching. The German Luftwaffe pilots, flying their lightning-fast Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, preyed on these stragglers, sweeping in for easy kills. But before the fighters could find them, the flak struck again. Another shell, or perhaps a salvo, burst directly beneath them. The plane rang like a bell. The radio compartment was shattered. The intercom crackled with a burst of static, then went silent. The plane was critically damaged. They were hemorrhaging altitude, descending rapidly into the thicker flak-filled air. The icy wind, now a screaming banshee, tore through the new holes in the plane's skin, ripping maps and papers into a whirlwind. Lieutenant John Cronin was now in an impossible situation. He and his co-pilot were physically wrestling with the controls, their muscles aching with the strain of fighting the dead engine. But the plane was dying. It was becoming unresponsive. They were still miles from friendly lines, and the ground below was a patchwork of German-held territory. Cronin could not save his aircraft. His only duty now was to try and save his men. The skies over Germany were a maelstrom of steel. What do you think was more terrifying for the crews? The flak from the ground or the fighters in the air? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Cronin looked at his co-pilot. No words were necessary. A silent understanding passed between them. The plane was just a machine. The men were his responsibility. He made the decision. With his left hand, he held the yoke, fighting to keep the plane from spiraling. With his right, he reached down to the control pedestal and flipped a small, unassuming switch. It was the C1, the Minneapolis Honeywell C1 autopilot. A sophisticated, almost rudimentary artificial brain of gyroscopes and pneumatic controls, designed to hold the heavy bomber steady on its long, monotonous bombing runs. He was engaging it to give his men a stable platform, a few precious seconds of level flight to escape. Then he hit the one switch every flyer dreaded, the loud, insistent, clanging bailout bell. The order echoed through the wounded ship, louder than the wind. Bail out! Bail out! Bail out! The train drilled for chaos began. One by one, the crew abandoned their posts. The bombardier and navigator in the nose had the most terrifying exit. They had to open the small hatch beneath their feet and tumble into the 20,000-foot void, hoping they cleared the chin turret. The radio operator, the flight engineer, and the waist gunners grabbed their chest pack, parachutes, clipped them onto their harnesses, and threw themselves out the main fuselage door, disappearing instantly into the slipstream. The ball turret gunner, in the most harrowing predicament, had to be manually cranked back into the ship before he could strap on his chute and join the others. The tail gunner, isolated at the far end of the plane, simply rolled out of his own hatch. Cronin, true to the captain's code, held his post. He fought the controls, which were now bucking against the inputs of the autopilot, a machine and a man in a brief, desperate duel. He counted them out in his head. 6, 7, 8, 9. Finally, checking that the cockpit beside him was empty, he relinquished his command. He couldn't use the door. He jammed his shoulder against the pilot's side window, forced it open, and threw himself out, tumbling away from his dying ship. He fell for several seconds, letting the plane clear him, then pulled his ripcord. The silk snapped open with a bone-jarring jolt, and he was suddenly suspended in a world of profound, shocking silence. He looked down. Miraculously, he could see them. 9 other white parachutes, his crew, his boys, blossoming like flowers against the green and brown of the earth below. And then he looked for his B-17. It was not, as he expected, spiraling toward its doom. Instead, in a moment that defied all logic, all training, and all physics, the pilotless aircraft straightened itself out. It had been relieved of the weight of its 10-man crew and its bomb load. The autopilot, set for level flight, was now in sole command. The plane, Phantom Fortress, stopped its rapid descent. It entered a long, slow, stable glide. It banked gently, as if considering its next move, and, with its 3 remaining engines still pulling, it flew on, disappearing into the clouds, heading west. This is the scene that greeted the Belgian farmers and, moments later, an advance patrol of British soldiers from the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division, who were cautiously clearing the area. They approached the B-17 in the Cronin field with extreme caution. This was still 1944. A perfectly landed enemy aircraft was almost certainly a Trojan horse, a booby trap. Weapons raised, they fanned out, surrounding the silent silver giant. They could hear a faint hum. It was the sound of the plane's electrical systems, the gyroscopes in the autopilot, still spinning. A single soldier, the bravest of the lot, climbed up the side and eased open the hatch, his rifle ready. He dropped into a scene from another dimension. The aircraft was pristine, save for the flak damage in the wing and the mud on its belly. It was completely, utterly empty. In the cockpit, the yokes were still, the seats vacant. But it was the small details, the human details, that elevated this from a simple anomaly to an enduring, haunting mystery. On the radio operator's table, a thermos of coffee was found. A soldier, touching it with a trembling hand, found that it was still lukewarm. Beside it, a package of sandwiches, one of them half eaten, the bread not yet stale. In the navigator's compartment, the classified mission logbooks and maps were still laid out, as if he had just stepped away for a moment. Parachutes, the spares, were still hanging on their racks, untouched. The investigators, baffled by the perfect gear-down landing, examined the cockpit's control pedestal. The autopilot, the C-1, was still engaged, its mechanical heart humming. This was the ghost in the machine. But even that couldn't explain what had happened. An autopilot of that era, as sophisticated as it was, could hold a plane level. It could not land it. It had no sensors to read the ground. It couldn't select the field. It couldn't flare for a landing. It couldn't perform a controlled power-off glide. The local Belgian witnesses, when questioned by the British, swore to a man that they had seen the plane circle the field once, slowly and deliberately, as if a pilot was inspecting the terrain for hazards. And then, in the most inexplicable detail of all, they claimed that just moments before touchdown, the B-17's landing gear, damaged by flak and unresponsive to the crew hours earlier, had partially deployed on their own. They hadn't fully extended, but they had dropped just enough to absorb the initial impact, allowing the Phantom Fortress to slide to its soft, gentle rest, instead of cartwheeling into a million pieces. A pilotless landing, still warm coffee, is a story that defies belief. If you find these hidden histories as fascinating as we do, please take a moment to hit that like button.
It truly helps our channel continue to unearth these incredible stories.
The story miraculously has two happy endings. The first and most important belongs to Lieutenant John Cronin and all 9 of his crewmen. Scattered by the wind, they landed across the Belgian countryside. One by one, they were found, hidden by the courageous members of the Belgian resistance who risked their own lives to shelter the Allied airmen. Within days, all 10 men were smuggled back to Allied lines, shaken but unharmed. They had survived the flak, they had survived the bailout, and they had survived the fall into enemy territory. Their story was one of terror, courage, and incredible astronomical luck. But the second story, that of their aircraft, became one of World War II's most enduring and inexplicable legends. The military cordoned off the site. Engineers from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces took the plane apart, piece by piece, looking for answers. They were baffled. They could offer theories, of course. They spoke of the B-17's legendary inherent stability. Pilots had long known that the fortress flew itself. They discussed how the precise combination of flak damage, the loss of engine number 3, the exact drag of the unfeathered propeller, and the precise trim settings Cronin had left might have, by a 1 in a billion chance, created a perfect, accidental aerodynamic equilibrium, a state that mimicked the landing glide. Perhaps the descending altitude, the thicker air, and the vibration had shaken the damaged half-powered landing gear loose. These are just theories. They are the cold, hard calculations of physics trying to explain a miracle. They are the rational mind trying to make sense of the uncanny. But they cannot explain the warm coffee. They cannot explain the half-eaten sandwich. And they cannot explain what the farmers of Cortenbear, the first witnesses, saw with their own eyes. A giant, wounded war machine, abandoned by its human masters, finding its own way home to a soft, safe landing in a foreign field, as if guided by a ghostly, benevolent hand. The event was recorded, documented, and filed away, but never truly solved. The phantom fortress of Cortenbear remains a testament to the chaos, the bravery, and the sheer unexplainable mystery of war. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into the files of history's greatest conflicts. We want to know what you think. Was this a 1 in a billion fluke of physics or something else? Let us know.